to this, there we are, welcome, to this second day of the symposium, I Am for an Art Criticism That. Of course, obviously, as we heard yesterday, based on the statement of Klaas Oldenburg, I am for an art that. But now we are talking about art criticism, art journalism, and art writing. I said day 2. Yesterday we had a very interesting first day together, or at Peter de Ruiter Center for Contemporary Art in Rotterdam, who actually approached the Stedelijk some months ago saying, we want to organize this symposium. Would the Stedelijk like to join in? Obviously, and of course we said yes, and thank you again for doing this with the Stedelijk. It's an honor to have you here and to have this second day. This symposium is also organized in the context of the prize for the young art critic, which will be awarded this evening. The prize is an initiative of the Apple Art Center, Peter de Ruiter, and the Mondriaan Fund, and is awarded biannually. This is the 3rd time, and so after the symposium we'll have a break to have a bite to eat and maybe have a drink, and then the award ceremony will continue at 7:30 also here in the auditorium. So please stick around for that, because it's going to be very exciting to see after a symposium that talks about sort of the status of contemporary art criticism, to look at the future, basically the young people who will do it. So yesterday, yeah, I'm not going to summarize it entirely. I do want to perhaps make a few observations, because it was a very full and interesting day. Definitely, I guess we'll also sort of get into it a bit, but I will do it from my point of view. Of course, a discussion about art criticism is for part a discussion about the form of art criticism, on which fora, what do we write and how do we write as well. But of course it should also be a discussion about why do we write and why are we still excited to write. And sometimes yesterday I did observe the discussion perhaps becoming slightly on the pessimistic side on things, so I do hope that we can have also an optimistic discussion. But why are we so excited to do this job? Because after all, it is a very exciting job, and we get to talk and write about, well, pretty fabulous artists, if I may say so myself. Also, I'd like to get into the sort of hybrid nature of what it means nowadays to be an art writer. I also maybe pointed it out very briefly in my question, like, of course you have people who make exhibitions, people who write about art, people who reflect on art in different manners, and I'll also be interested this afternoon to talk about how this sort of hybridness of what the art critic is nowadays, that we can put that in the limelight as well. I took this from you, Daphne. It works really well to read off the phone. I think I'm going to do this from now on. Now I'm a bit off guard. Oh yeah, of course, of course, as I mentioned very briefly, we should consider, and that's also sort of in the abstract of this symposium that you'll find on your seat, to consider different types of art writing. As I mentioned, there's sort of the traditional art criticism, there's art critique, but definitely also art journalism, which I also look forward to in the lecture perhaps, but certainly in the discussion afterwards, to get into how do these different types of writing relate to each other. So there's also sort of a hybridness in there that I want to get into. And lastly, maybe, and I know this is a lot to talk about in 3 hours, but perhaps we can do it over dinner as well, how sort of art criticism can exist in or are actually on different platforms. I know we are sort of here together today to discuss specifically art criticism, but more often than not we invite speakers to the Stedelijk to talk about an exhibition, about an artist, or we invite the artist her or himself to talk about art, and I would like to think that that is some kind of form of art criticism. So I actually look forward to hearing what you think about how sort of institutional frameworks can function as a form of art criticism as well, which is also why the Stedelijk was so excited to be a part of this symposium, as we are really thinking about how to contribute to different kind of frameworks from our own specific institutional framework. well, that sort of sums up the questions I want to put forward. Before I get into the program, I'm going to give the floor to you. Daphne doesn't need an introduction because she's director of Peter de Ruiter and co-organizer of this symposium.
Thank you, Hendrik. We're delighted by your generosity to allow us to be in Amsterdam. Of course, we're sort of getting our foot even stronger in Rotterdam at Witte de Wit. Pleasure to be here and launch our first collaboration with Stedelijk. Yesterday at Witte de Wit was indeed a terrific day, actually evening and afternoon, and with a stellar roster of writers, editors, journalists, poets, one artist, we admit it has to be more, and from UK, US, China, Turkey, Belgium, of course Netherlands, and the nation of blogosphere. We were very proud that we were actually trending so high in Twitter with the hashtag art criticism. It was really interesting to see between all the speakers how we're thinking about art criticism as it's being shaped and sculpted as well with the new digital interfaces, which Jörg Heiser called the techno world, the digital Wild West. Those who missed it can see it soon online. We've been streaming it, we were streaming yesterday, but we will put them online. And a rough transcription will also be made available so you don't feel like you missed what happened yesterday at Witte de Wit. What was also, yeah, I'm short, sorry, thanks. And after so much input from across the world, actually on Twitter, we're certainly looking forward to the keynote that's going to take place today, which will anchor it all in the Dutch history, because it was fantastic to hear from our keynote speaker today that art criticism gets to be talked about every 3 to 5 years since pre-Second World War. So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel all the time. And yesterday we also screened an interview with Godard, more from a film criticism point of view, how he always wants to be criticized, but with solid evidence, and the conversation he was having was completely almost an echo, a mirror of what we were doing in the room to our packed audience. One comment also came out between how the food criticism in crisis vis-a-vis the art criticism, and how we should actually cross-fertilize and look, and maybe that's something we can actually also do more in the future together. We organized and invited our guests to contribute to and enhance the context, of course, of the prize for the Jonge Kunstkritik, which is an initiative of ours, and the Apple, Ande Meester is here, and Mondrian, Birgit Donker is here as well. And the prize is meant to increase the awareness and the quality of Dutch art criticism. Even though right now we're speaking English, we will switch to Dutch with the award that will ensue the panel. And the title of the symposium, which Hendrik mentioned, but for us, we took the inspiration from Oldenburg's 1961 manifesto, I Am for an Art. And similarly to an art manifesto, we organized a symposium in a way to potentially inspire, stimulate each other, but also offend and shock, to cover and uncover the fertile grounds of arts journalism, art criticism, and visual arts per se. We didn't want to go for an essayistic or academic style. We wanted to leave enough room with our categories to play with. So here we are, peer-to-peer. Most of you are actually invested in the field, so it's a great conversation together to tool and retool, connect and reconnect. Some of the participants of yesterday and today have never met each other, and it's also great that they can find mirrors in each other, even though they are from different parts of the world, and we're very proud that each of them is a terrific practitioner in their field. So honored to be in their presence. Thank you again, Stedelijk, for the collaboration, and maybe you'd like to introduce our keynote speaker.
Just saw that I forgot to introduce myself, but thankfully my name was on the screen. Before I give you a brief overview of the program, I'd like to ask you to turn your cell phones on mute so the speakers won't be disturbed in the lecture. I'm explicitly not asking you to put your phones off because, of course, we hope you tweet and you Facebook and you show that digital social media can be much a platform of discussion and debate, as this very room that we are in. Yes, most of you have seen the program leaflet. If not, it is available here as well. But in a few minutes, the first lecture will take place by Peter de Ruiter from 4:15, and we have until 5:15 to also gather some questions. At 5:15, the panel, the first and actually only panel of this afternoon, will take place, called I Am for an Art Criticism That is Self-Reflective. That's with Birgit Donker, Carol Liu, Ali Akay, Anthony Downey, and moderated by myself and Amira, who you saw yesterday as well. Then we'll actually take a break, and then of course we will all be back here at 7:30 for the award ceremony of the prize for the young art critic. I think it's about high time that I stop talking and give the floor to Peter de Ruiter, who is assistant professor of modern and contemporary art at the Rijksuniversiteit in Groningen, and you can find all his biographical information in the leaflet. So Peter, welcome and thank you, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Hendrik. First of all, I want to thank the Peter de Ruiter staff, of course, Amira, and Daphne and Renee. We had a beautiful afternoon and evening yesterday in Rotterdam, talking a lot about criticism in a national and international context. It was really exciting, and I'm proud to stand here in the rebuilt Stedelijk. I just saw the collection. Actually, it was for the first time, shame on me. But I think it's beautiful again to see all those paintings from the old masters, from, let's say, Breitner up to our own time. And, well, that's the first thing I wanted to say. Congratulations, Stedelijk. Good. My talk will at least take 40 minutes or something like that. I prepared a lecture only for 30 minutes, but I had a lot of joy to do it. So it takes 40 minutes, and I hope you will enjoy the talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I have not the intention to make you sad or to bring you in a funeral mood or something like that, but the image of death is haunting many people in the art world. It's the death of the art critic. Although the art critic has a regular death every 5 years or something like that in the Netherlands, since the publication of Ronan MacDonald's book, The Death of the Critic, in 2007, now 5 years ago, and 4 years earlier, James Elkin's pamphlet-like book, What Happened to Art Criticism, 4 years earlier, in 2003, this image of death is firmly rooted in the minds of many people. MacDonald's remarkable book is, of course, more nuanced and is actually on the literary scene in England. But is it true what people say, that the art critic has lost his position, his voice, in the debate of going on in the art world, and that curators have taken over his position? Is it true that art criticism isn't worth a dime, and the last critic of real importance was the American Clement Greenberg, the eminent New York-based critic, formalist critic who discussed the visual arts as medium-orientated and as serious optical business of the eye and the mind? The man who championed the world of Pollock, Newman, de Kooning, those masters you can see upstairs. Well, my answer is, it is not that serious. After Greenberg, a lot has happened in the art world in art criticism as a first reaction on contemporary art. Art criticism is not dead. There is, for instance, a lot of blogging on the internet. There are many art journals, some of them also on the net. In other words, there's a lot of writing on contemporary art in all kinds of media, also in newspapers and weekly magazines, of course. So art criticism is not dead, it's alive and kicking. Yet I'm not as optimistic as I seem to be. Indeed, art criticism is alive and kicking. There is a lot of writing, and that's exactly what James Elkins says. Yesterday evening we talked with the Turkish colleague about Elkins. It's a small book, 100 pages or something, but it's exactly what he says. There's a lot of writing, but who reads the critic? But the kicks, in my opinion, are not as effective as they used to be in the time of Greenberg, so in the 50s and 60s. That means the C of the word criticism has lost its importance, its vitality and its impact. In other words, the judgmental element of criticism has been pushed into the background. So what follows is that much art critical writing is not art criticism at all, even in art critical magazines, at home and abroad. It's not about analyzing and judging an artwork from a certain viewpoint. It's not about saying something about its quality or about its intentions, the intentions of the artist and the way he succeeded or not succeeded in realizing his artistic goals. I would say the very essence of art criticism. Sometimes art criticism is not about art at all, but only about context. This is a statement, and I know it's not a very original one, but I think we are all aware of it. And this situation gives us munition to say art criticism is in crisis. It is hotly debated. Art criticism is dead. Well, if that is the case, the crisis lasts already 45 years. Because in my view, something changed in the 70s. And this was the epoch that saw art journalism arise in favor of art criticism. And art journalism is about a lot of things, but not about analyzing, not about evaluating the intrinsic qualities of the artwork, or what artworks have to say to us, or analyzing and evaluating the art scene as such. Okay, although art criticism is not more than 250 years old at this moment, it was Denis Diderot, the French thinker, who laid the foundations for a serious modern art critical practice in the Age of Enlightenment, 1750, the tradition is strong and tells us a lot about reflecting on art in a certain period. Important critics always influenced the debate on contemporary art, even when they were totally wrong in their vision or opinions. When you read, for instance, Baudelaire on photography, you understand exactly what I mean. I mean, Baudelaire was wrong in his opinions on photography. Photography had a future, but he found it nothing because he missed the aspect of imagination. It was too much a realistic kind of art. So in the minds of strong critics, criticism is always interesting and always had and will have, I hope, a capital C. But the question now is, why has art criticism with a capital C, and now I confine myself to the situation in the Netherlands, become more or less invisible? Well, there are some historical reasons which I will bring under your attention, but I really think that it has also to do with the way contemporary art is appreciated at this moment. I think much contemporary art is appreciated as funny. It must be spectacular, or it must at least be distraction. In this respect, there is a great difference between the way people look at old art and the way they look at contemporary, very young art. Perhaps it's not fair to make a comparison, but a few days ago I visited the really beautiful Jan van Eyck exposition in the Boijmans, the road to Van Eyck. I would say go to Rotterdam and see that beautiful exhibition, it's marvelous. Well, it was crowded there with people, many people, and really everybody was very engaged and was looking very concentrated. Now, contemporary art is less sacred, I would say, than old art. But I think that for many people, contemporary art actually has lost its urgency and its sincere character. In the last 2 years, and now I need another slide, which doesn't come. Even. So we're living in the age of techniques since 200 years or something, but yeah, that's it. And then again, okay. Yeah, the thing that I talked about. Old art, it is much more sacred, a kind of sacrosanctity around it. But I think that for many people, contemporary art has lost its urgency, as I said, and its sincere character. In the last 2 years, for instance, while visiting Spain in my summer holidays, I saw a lot of fun-making people around artworks, such as, for instance, the Salvador Dali, that's up there at the right, in Figueres, of course, in Catalonia, and Jeff Koons' very famous artwork, The Puppy, which is made of flowers. It is positioned in front of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. Also elsewhere, in Paris, for instance, we encounter funny artworks. Niki de Saint-Phal, for instance, and Tinguely, in the water basin near the Centre Pompidou in Paris. Those works, although they are excellent artworks, in my opinion, symbolize what young people seem to appreciate most at this moment, although I'm not very sure about it. But it is a joyful and funny art. And of course, the internet and the social media play their role too. Everything is funny, and it makes fun to share what is funny. How can a characteristic art critical voice be heard if art is funny, or must be spectacular in the eyes of so many people? Although the taste for literary works also has been changed, it was Rudy Fuchs who said already in the 70s that the books of Kees van Kooten were low literature. He didn't like it at all. It was low literature, a kind of kitsch. So although the taste for literary works also has been changed, and the literary critic actually lies under fire as well, such is the case for the art critic, most of the time we still talk with respect about a new book of this or that author, a new biography, for instance, on Coetzee or Willem Kloos. But when it concerns the contemporary visual arts, and I talk about artworks which are 4 or 5 or 2 years old, everybody has something to say about it and has an opinion. Point is that to read a book of 300 pages, it takes serious work of at least 6-7 hours. But an artwork can be seen in a few seconds. 1.5 hours ago, I was upstairs, and I was in the room with the beautiful Marlene Dumas paintings, and there was a woman coming in, and she saw the 12 portraits of the Arab people, you know. Some of them were murderers, and other are people from the street where Marlene Dumas is living nearby here in Amsterdam. So it's a series of portraits which really shakes you awake. And the woman said, "That's nothing, rubbish," and she walked on. So that will never, never occur with old art. And then we're talking about Marlene Dumas. And it was an old woman, old in the sense that she was perhaps 45 years old or something like that. Okay, in this situation, in the culture we are living in at this moment, Mike Kelly, the exhibition is organized now and will be opened 15th December. Mike Kelly really can be called a nonsense artist by the public, and Mondrian can be esteemed as important as, for instance, Escher. Well, Escher certainly has made beautiful things, but he is not of the same stature as Mondrian. Against the background of all this, I think art criticism could explain that and could play a vital role and be of great value in a time in which everything seems to be of equal importance in our culture. And art is more than once discussed ironically as either funny or incomprehensible or as total nonsense or even as a plaything of left-wing politics, which is called the Wilders effect. We all know that. Now, the character of art criticism has also been changed because the art world as such, the infrastructure of it, has been changed. The main players in that art world, that is the museum, its director, the curators working in that museum, the flying curators all over the world. There are people working in the curatorial scene, the galleries, the dealers, the critics. They've all taken other positions since the 60s and the 70s, a time when an alternative curating became popular. In the history of curating means tentoonstellingen maken, the status of Harold Zeeman is almost sacred, and not without reason, I think. Zeeman formulates a new kind of exhibition and a new kind of thinking on exhibiting art. We all know that at least since then, so since the 60s, the curator has become more and more important. As in my old days, I get a dry mouth, so I have to drink something. So the infrastructure has been changed. Curators have become important. And so, by consequence, the position of the art critic has been changed. Once, it was in the very center of the debate. But that is really history. In the next decades, we will not forget Harold Zeeman. I'm sure about it. But will we still remember and read Stuart Morgan as a critic of the 80s and the 90s, a man who wrote a remarkable, strong book on the art scene in the 80s? I don't know, I don't think so. Our time is a time of crossovers between all kinds of media. It's called intermediality. Painting, sculpture, film, music, science, design, etc. All kinds of media that have made the visual arts more or less complex. One of the main tasks of a serious critic would be to tell the public why that is the case, how these crossovers can be explained, what is going on, how the relation between contemporary art and older art could be seen, and last but not least, what is interesting, what is good, what is mediocre, or what is bad art, and of course, why that is so. But as I said, it's a kind of repetition, almost a zero work. The voice of the critic is not so loud as Greenberg's voice was. Analyzing, judging, evaluating as serious elements in art criticism based on a set of personal insights, either moral or politically or aesthetic insights, well, it all seemed to be a little bit old-fashioned. Okay, then I am an old-fashioned type of person, because I still believe that these elements are essential. And judging in art criticism, when it's done with attention, that means thoughtful, can bring it back in the center of the art world, where, in my opinion, it belongs. Now, to explain all this a little bit, let me first start by pointing out what I researched the last 2 years. I've been researching Dutch art criticism. Again, it doesn't work, so I need help again. No next slide.
Well, what is there?
I don't know.
This one?
Yeah, that's the one.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry. So it did work. Actually. Okay, sorry. Okay. I've been researching Dutch art criticism and art journalism in newspapers and weekly magazines in the 70s and in the 80s of the 20th century. And the main topic of my research concerns the revival of figurative painting and, in a lesser degree, of sculpture, as seen through the eyes of the art critics after a period of neo-avant-garde movements in the 60s and 70s, such as minimalism and zero and conceptual art. So when we talk about a revival of painting, just think about those painters such as Julian Schnabel in America or our own René Daniels. But of course, think also about the Italian trans-avant-garde, Cucchi, Chia, and others. So the results, I hope, will be published as an anthology of art critical texts next year. This book is just the first volume of a series of books on art criticism in the Netherlands from 1885 till 2010. And the first 2 volumes are on the slide. Well, I'm telling you all this actually because one of my main issues in this lecture is based on the above-mentioned research. In the 70s and early 80s, art criticism changed slowly into the direction of art journalism, as I said before. And this is the situation we are still in. Okay, why such an ambitious project that spans more than a century? Dutch art criticism from the late 19th century up till now? The answer is simple. Because there is so much worth reading or rereading in this field. There's so much quality in art critical writing in the Netherlands. And so much is unknown for a younger public. I think also for an older public. And then I'm not only just thinking about Karel Blotkamp or Anna Tilru or Janneke Wesseling or Hans en Hartog Jager, more or less prominent names in the field of Dutch art criticism. There is a lot more. So that evoked my title as a paraphrase on that brilliant and humoristic crime comedy of the Coen brothers, Burn After Reading. My proposal would be, don't burn after reading these art critical writings, or throw them away, but put them in a map on a shelf and reread them now and then. Reread the best art critical writings in the 20th century in the Netherlands, because there's so much quality. Well, before I plunge into history, let me start by first saying something about the situation at this very moment. The actuality of modern and contemporary art, that means its development in all its vibrancy, and what is shown in galleries and in museums worldwide is very complicated and at first sight chaotic. It happens everywhere. And not only in the larger cities in Europe and America, We all know that since at least 25 years or so, it also happens in Istanbul, in some towns in China, as Beijing. In South Korea it happens, in South Africa, in Brazil. When you know the ins and outs of e-art now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Every 20 minutes or so, an email pops up and shakes you awake, remembering you of the fact that you cannot miss this or that exhibition. In Belfast, Peter de Ruiter's exhibition, Imaginary Places. In Berlin, the project Right to Left, that focuses on the question what is currently happening in the Middle East in terms of visual culture and society. In Munich, photographs of Hiroshi Sugimoto. In other words, contemporary art is everywhere, is of all nationalities, even regions. And yeah, it's shown everywhere. Everywhere in the world are biennals and triennals, everywhere are solos or group exhibitions. So the production of new art is enormous, and the same is true for the distribution. Young curators do their utmost best to bring this new art and try to do that from more or less engaged or original viewpoints. Indeed, the curator plays a vital role, as I said already. Now one could say, well, there's a serious task for art criticism. But this is a very difficult task because there is simply too much. And because there is too much, most of the exhibited art remains unseen and will not or never be discussed. That's a fact. To quote my colleague, the Flemish art critic and philosopher Bart Verschaffel, he says about very much art criticism is unanimously, she keeps her mouth shut. Zo, hè? Over zeer veel kunst is de kritiek het eens. Ze zwijgt er gewoon over. By the way, keeping the mouth shut happens everywhere, also in our own country. I'm based in Groningen town. In Groningen, there are some respectable, really respectable galleries, such as Sign, NP3, Photo Gallery Noorderlicht. But quite seldom, the exhibitions that are organized in these galleries are more or less seriously criticized by the important newspapers or weekly magazines or periodicals. Well, newspapers and weekly magazines have their priorities, and so they just skip them. But the reason for not reporting on these exhibitions is not totally clear. A, has it to do with the quality of what is shown? B, has it to do with the editing policy of the newspaper or weekly magazine? And C, has it to do with distance? Is Groningen too far for Randstad-based critics, perhaps? I do not hope so, but it just could be. Now, when we take a closer look at what is happening in the Groninger Museum at this moment, we can draw the following conclusions. The exhibition Urban Gothic of Mark Bijl, left, still to be seen in Groningen, has had more or less serious attention in the press, for instance in the Volkskrant and in NRC Handelsblad. But the one of Yin, it's on the right, one of the prominent artists in China at this moment and internationally high profile, was not remarked in a more or less serious way. Why is that so? Because the Yin exhibition was a bad exposition, or is there another reason? Indeed, I think there is another reason. I think Urban Gothic is much more attractive, much more sexy. You can say much more Kees van Twist-like. It's still the sphere of Kees van Twist which is in the museum, the former director of the museum. It's much more to talk about compared with the more reflective and less spectacular art of Yin. In my view, Dutch art criticism missed the point. So what happens is that the spectator is sent into the forest, not knowing the reasoned opinions of critics who reflect seriously on art. Let's go back to what I said earlier. Due to an overwhelming production and distribution of art, much art is not spotted or seen, but of course, much still is. Now, something important is taking place at this moment, because against the background of all that is seen and written about, the position of art criticism in the total field of reporting is a rather modest one, bescheiden. And by circumstance, this position is more and more marginalized in the last 5 till 10 years. A serious and bad thing when we see that. Because the newspapers and weekly magazines are operating under pressure, economically and financially. So there is less and less space for more or less longer articles on the visual arts and the contemporary arts. What remain is mostly short art journalism, which is in the hands of many who are not art critics at all, rather small articles concerning hot news in the art world. For instance, the throwing in the air, you saw it perhaps on YouTube, of cats by the equipe of Jan Fabre in Antwerp. Of course, there are also more serious articles, but limited in quantity, and often not longer than 300 or 400 words. The most interesting articles, of course, are published in the so-called appendixes, the bijlages, of the Wednesday, Thursday and Friday editions of our newspapers. Now, the field of players has been changed over the last 5 years or 10 years. In this field, the art critic is often not at home. He is simply not there. Joost Zwageman, for instance, is almost a celebrity compared with the daily art critic. In the TV program De Wereld Draait Door, he had for some time the freedom to say what he thinks about the work of this or that artist. Meanwhile, we all know that he's deeply moved by the work of Mark Rothko. Also, we know that from the Volkskrant. He is actually the Pierre Jansen of our time. So nothing wrong with that, because Pierre Jansen had, and Zwageman still has, a very stimulating role. I'm not negative about it. And for those who are from abroad, Pierre Jansen was an eminent art critic in the 50s and 60s. And well, when he talked about art, I remember something from television that he was talking about a little Etruscan statue, not bigger than this size. And he talked with so much erudition and also with that strange emotion in his voice that you came to believe that it was really, really very important what he was talking about. So, Zwageman has that same role, actually. Now, Zwageman is in the middle. At the left is Jasper Krabbe. His father is even more well known, but he's doing more or less the same thing. He also popularizes modern and contemporary art for the public on television, also by sometimes giving a lecture, for instance, on account of the presentation of Warhol's The Last Supper in the Nieuwe Kerk in Amsterdam. So that really is a tendency. The art circuit recruits more or less well-known poets, writers, or even artists, visual artists, to give a talk on a specific subject concerning the visual arts. Or like the poet Ramzi Nasser, to do the opening of a new exhibition and tell the public something. Well, nothing wrong with that, I would say. Above all, that has always been the case. In the 30s, it was Jan Greshoff or Simon Vesdijk who did the same. And Jan Wolkers did it in the 80s. But perhaps it is symptomatic for the invisibility of the art critic, because what really was at stake with Warhol's exhibition was an interesting art critical question. What is the Last Supper? as a silkscreen painting, een zeefdruk, telling us about this famous fresco of Leonardo da Vinci in Milan? Or what is that Last Supper telling us about the possibilities of a Christian iconography in an unchurched, ontkerkelijkte samenleving, in an unchurched society? And why is this silkscreen not as strong and as satisfactory as many, many other works of Warhol? I found it rather a dull painting, but perhaps Warhol was very conscious about the dullness of the painting. Then the critic has to say something about that. So what was the intention of this very Warhol silkscreen painting? A lot of people, more than 35,000 people went to the Nieuwe Kerk, the new church, to visit the exhibition, which was only one thing, the silkscreen. Okay, television offers us a lot, such as Opium, the VPRO TV program Rel, Romein en Lamoré, very ironical program, I would say, sometimes, or the new VPRO TV program Sarah's Barbare, in which artists such as Brian Kenny are presented. Also, the internet offers a lot news. Did you see, for instance, what Anne de Meester, director of the Appel Art Center, says about the work of young artists? It's really very stimulating. But all this is, of course, not art criticism. Is that a bad thing? No, I don't think so. There's nothing wrong with good art journalism or witty TV journalism. Let me be honest, I prefer reading a good informed art journalistic article above a bad informed and very subjective art criticism. But again, where is that art criticism hidden? Although there are some art critical writings in, for instance, Metropolis M or the Witte Raaf, there is a predominance of art journalism in all its aspects, on television, internet, newspapers, etc., etc. Now, can we point out a beginning of this tendency? Then I'm going back in history. Art criticism and art journalism have always been together, as in a rather relaxed brother-sister relationship. In earlier times, let's say around 1900 or so, the art journalist sometimes was a sharp critic. So as a journalist, he was also a sharp critic. This was, for instance, the case with Johan de Meester, actually a man from the literary field working for the Nieuwe Rotterdamse Courant. And the man saw in a very early stage the qualities of Van Gogh. And he wrote about it as soon as he had found the right words to do so. So here we see going together art journalism and art criticism. There are also interviews in this period in the Netherlands and abroad. In 1899, the first book was published under sculptor Rodin, titled Auguste Rodin Statuaire, which was written by Léon Maillard, not an art critic, but a journalist. But in the beginning of the 20th century, it was art criticism that dominated. In the 10s, 20s and 30s, art criticism was in the first place criticism with a capital C. In a certain way, we do not have to be nostalgic about this period, because there also was very bad criticism. But if you read art critical texts of those critics who were really engaged with the visual arts, who were sharp and thoughtful, and who tried to evaluate art according to their vision on art and society, well, then you are more than once perplexed. Those critics often had strong opinions about the intrinsic qualities of a painting or sculpture. And they try to base their opinions, and that's really important, on arguments. They had also strong opinions about the functioning of art in our society. There was something to fight for or to fight against. Jan Engelman, for instance, he is shown on the right slide. Jan Engelman, for instance, he took really position as a Catholic art critic, and he wrote in favor of certain artists in Brabant and Limburg. Joep Nicolaas, for instance, or Hendrik Wiegersma. But for Hammacher, who is shown left, above the beautiful portrait of Charlie Torop, for Hammacher, religion was not important at all. His art critical thoughts were colored by humanism. In his eyes, art was life's essence. And he chose for the work of artists such as Charlie, or the almost abstract Jacob Bendien, or the totally abstract Piet Mondriaan. Hammacher and Engelman were very different from each other, but they had strong opinions, and they articulated these opinions with care. Well, there is nothing wrong with rereading their texts, and please don't burn them after reading. It would be a waste. The most interesting art critical texts are those which have reached an equilibrium between information, analysis, and judgment, and which are persuasive in their argumentation. Of course, those critics also had their blind spots. They didn't see, for instance, the importance of surrealism and the possibilities of surrealism in the beginning of the 30s. They were so strong in their convictions that good art was in essence expressionist or abstract. They were so strong in those opinions that those weird and sometimes threatening paintings of surrealists were really menacing their tastes, and more than that, were menacing society and high culture. But being a reader of, for instance, the Nieuwe Rotterdamse Courant or even the Telegraaf, you knew what those critics were talking about, and that's important. You knew what they were talking about because you had read already more of those persons. As I knew, for instance, in my youth, so 30 years ago, what the remarkably good critic Kees Vens was talking about when he wrote about literature in the Volkskrant. And I can say that Kees Vens has been an important critic in that sense for me, that he built my own Bildung. So that's important as an aspect of art criticism too. Now let's have a look at art criticism after the Second World War, and then I come to an end. After the Second World War, our material and cultural world was actually in a state of disorder or even chaos. And okay, it's again wrong. Sorry. It's strange. Yep. After the Second World War, our material and cultural world was in a state of disorder or even chaos, and just like art, criticism had to reconquer its position. It took some years. When we would reread the old texts of Kees Doelman, Charles Wentink, and again Bram Hammacher, and then we would see that art criticism had that same old function of informing, opinion-making on arguments, and criticizing, again, with a capital C for that criticizing. So that same function as it had before the Second World War. Well, the anthology my colleague Jonneke Jobse has made in the above-mentioned series of Dutch art criticism shows perfectly how strong opinions and value judgments dominated the debates on contemporary art in the 50s. She actually studied the years from 45 till 60, a period when the consequences of the Cold War were front page news. Well, in this period, the Stedelijk Museum, under the directorate of Willem Zandberg, mounted epoch-making exhibitions such as Mondriaan in 46, Cobra in 49, and the slide left, well, that's about the Cobra exhibition in 49. Young American Paints in 58, where the work of Pollock at the right was shown for the first time in the Stedelijk, and the exhibition The Vitality of Art in 59. These 4 exhibitions were received with much tam-tam. There was much rumor about, as if the visual arts had to be reinvented again. In a time without social media, without internet, television, and even without serious attention of the radio, the critics saw it as their task to inform the public as good as they could. And the same happened actually on the occasion of the exhibition program in the Stedelijk Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, where Ede de Wilde was the director. In this time, the critic had to take position, and because of that, he wrote in a much more persuasive style than later in the century. The art critical writings of Wenting, for instance, now a totally forgotten art critics of the 50s and 60s, were very sharp, very literary, and sometimes they were really confronting the reader. Now, in the 60s, we see the emergence of another type of art critic with an art historical background. Although subjective criticism is still very strong in the 60s, a more detached kind of criticism comes to the foreground, more or less parallel with developments in contemporary art, such as Zero or minimal art. So young critics, yeah, it's functioning. Young critics have come to the foreground who have studied, for instance, in Leiden or in Utrecht or elsewhere. Now, this is a very interesting moment in the history of Dutch art criticism, that's for sure. Rudy Fuchs, for instance, who is shown left, who for some time was a very intelligent reader of Clement Greenberg's formalist art criticism, and also Karel Blotkamp, who was there speaking with Armando. They wrote their very sharp, very intense, and totally transparent texts. They wrote on such artists as Jan Schoonhoven on the slide, or Ad Dekkers, or Sal Lewitt, or other artists from that period. And they formulated their thoughts as exactly as possible. And this also is a very essential characteristic of good art criticism. If you read Baudelaire or Herbert Reed or Apollinaire or even John Ruskin in the 19th century, or you read Fuchs or Blotkamp, Tilroe, of course, always sharp and always very good as stylistic writers. Now, in their hands, criticism seems to be less judgmental. But that is not true. Blotkamp, for instance, in Vrij Nederland, and Fuchs in the Gids, were in a position to write about whatever they wanted. And in that way, they were partisans. Ze waren partijganger. They choose whatever they found interesting or important. By the way, both had an eye for context, but that always was the context in an art historical sense. So when Fuchs was writing about Schoonhoven or Ad Dekkers, he also wanted to reflect on Mondriaan. Now, with Blotkamp, Fuchs, and some others, Dutch art criticism was quite outspoken in those years, the late 60s and early 70s. There really was a very high standard of thinking about good art and writing about it. But in the mid-70s, something changed. Perhaps that can be illustrated by pointing out that in Vrij Nederland, Blotkamp's position in 74 was quite suddenly uncertain. It was Rinus Ferdinandussen, chief editor of Vrij Nederland, who wrote him in a letter that his art criticism was too severe, too intellectual. And a short time later, Blotkamp stopped writing for this weekly journal. And also Fuchs had stopped in 73. And Cor Bloch, another one who was very good at that time, he would stop some years later. Now around that time, and I think indeed 75 is a beautiful cipher to remember, around that time the way of writing on contemporary art changed in character. And a new type of critic was emerging with a more journalistic mentality and with much attention for the context of art. And it is difficult to determine exactly what factors have played a decisive role. Was it art itself that had been changed? But art is always changing. Or did the policy of the newspapers provide an important factor? Anyway, there's too much to talk about, but in these years, art journalism began to dominate more and more. Yes, and in the hand of Lili van Ginneke, who's shown in the slide at the right side, art criticism developed in a kind of art journalism. I'm not going to say that Lili van Ginneke was a bad critic. Actually, she was not a critic, she was a journalist. And she did a very good thing, because in the Volkskrant, where many people were really attacking modern art, I mean, Jan Blokker was one of them, who thought that modern art or contemporary art was nothing at all. And he said to Lili, "What are you talking about? I don't understand a word of what you're writing." She told me that. So, I hold Lili van Ginneke in high esteem, but she is one of the first critics, I think, who began to write more in an art journalistic way. She did not forget to make a judgment. She didn't like it, actually, and that's something other. What we also see is that the interview became very important in those years, in the hands of Lili van Ginneke and also of Philip Peters. In this period, the interview as a supreme form of journalism began really to dominate. So interviews with Penck, with Lüpertz, with all kinds of artists. The interview has its origin in the 19th century, actually, and even perhaps earlier, but never before in the history of art writing so many interviews were held as in the late 70s and 80s. Now I've come to the end of my talk, and it's time. The 70s and 80s really saw the predominance of art journalist writing. Amidst so much art journalist writing in newspapers and weekly journals, and viewing on television, and listening to the radio, and blogging, etc., I say the need for a really good art criticism is still a concrete and urgent one, perhaps more than ever, I would say. And I'm not looking back in a nostalgic way to the 50s or 60s, when much art criticism was written against the background of a more or less polemic climate in the Cold War. It was for or against abstract expressionism. It was for or against even the geometrical abstractions of Kandinsky from his Bauhaus period, in his exhibition in '48 in The Hague. In other words, there was a lot of attacking and defending. And that's, of course, a great difference with our own situation. Why should one attack or defend contemporary art? Why should a critic defend or attack the position of Luc Tuymans or Gerhard Richter or Thomas Struth? There is nothing left to fight for, is there? Well, still I think we really need a kind of sincere criticism. And with real criticism, I mean an art criticism that tries to analyze, to evaluate, etc. And I'm aware of the fact that more than 75% of the art critics at this moment have a strong opinion about that. They say that the value judgment, het vellen van een waardeoordeel dus, is the least interesting part of art criticism. But I think this is really bullshit. This is cheap talk. Value judgment is still operational in the work of some Dutch art critics, for sure in the work of Den Hartog-Jager, Wesseling, Tilroe, and some others. But it's not enough. And their articles are becoming lesser and smaller and lesser and smaller. So I think value judgments can only be done by persons or personalities who really have the intuition and the morale to do so, to show the reader the complex hybridization of the art world, with disciplines varying from painting, installation art, design, and new media, performance and filmmaking. It's all very complex. Okay, by the way, on the occasion of the prize, we cannot expect this from very young persons. Sometimes a very young critic has a fine-tuned intuition combined with a beautiful and strong pen. Blotkamp was such a critic. He made his debut in Vrij Nederland when he was 22 years old, in '67. Okay, that is exceptional. A young critic has to grow. That's for sure. So when Bram Hammacher began writing in 1919, he was also 22 years old, but it took him 4 years to develop. He needed 4 or 5 years to become a mature critic. And the same was true for his colleague, Jos de Ruiter. So good art criticism, just as good art, needs time to become mature. So let us give time and space, physical space, to the real talents and give them all the credits we possibly can give them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this extremely informative talk and also for allowing us an opportunity to put all the questions that we've been talking about in the past 2 days into a very local history and context. I think that's really helpful. Would you mind taking a few questions now, or would you prefer to do after the panel? Like maybe just looking at you. Are there any very urgent questions? Do you have a question? Yeah, I'll go to the back. We have 5 minutes. Just wait until I'm there.
Hi, sorry? Yeah, I was just about to. Hi, I'm Robert Jan Muller, and my question is, could you give a definition of journalism when you compare it with art criticism? So what's the essential difference between the two?
Yeah. Well, it's not so difficult. I think you have to begin with the word art criticism. So art criticism is always about judgments, about saying something in a judgmental way. So something you like or not, or is mediocre. But you have to, yeah, well, but you have to give...
You means that's an individual opinion?
Yeah, you give your opinion, but on the basis of arguments. So that's art criticism. Let's first say what, in my opinion, is art criticism. It's a word that was already used by the old Greeks before Jesus Christ was born, you know? And art criticism has a very long reputation, which starts in the 17th century, so in the time before Diderot began to write. But the difference with art journalism is that for an art journalist, it's not necessary to speak in value judgments. It's just about informing the public as good as he can. And that's nothing wrong with it. So in the time that in the Volkskrant, Anna Tilroe began to write in 84 actually, she began to write in 83 in the Haagse Post, and after that in 84 in the Volkskrant, it was very judgmental criticism. But at the same time, we see in the Volkskrant another person writing, Paul de Pont, and his articles were very art journalist. So he avoided to give a strong opinion based on arguments, and there was no judgmental element in his writings at all. So I think in the total spectrum of art writing, we have art criticism, we have reviewing, we have journalism, etc. It's okay, it's okay. But my opinion is that art criticism is almost finished, and that's a bad situation. That's all. Of course, there's a middle field, I guess. Yeah, well, the middle field, those are the Zwagermannen and the Krabbe's and a lot of other persons who are doing very good work. It's a good job what Zwageman is doing.
We have a few questions in the back.
Yeah, I also had just a definition question. How would you define contexts? You were using it as a bad example of what art criticism shouldn't be, but I can imagine there's a lot of interesting context also.
Of course.
But what is for you the difference?
Yeah. Well, when you overlook the development of art criticism, then you can say that most of the critics working before Second World War and also after Second World War were writing about the qualities of the artwork in a specific art historical context. So even Fuchs and Blotkamp did that. So they compared, for instance, Jan Schoonhoven or Aldekkers with Mondrian or Van Doesburg. But context is, of course, a very general term you can fill in with many, many things. So in the development of art criticism and art writing, we see that the context is changing from the art historical scene to the scene of civilization or politics or philosophy, etc. Now, I'm not against context, but for me it's important that the artwork will not be forgotten in this kind of writing. I mean, I like to read art critical texts with context, of course. So when a philosophical or a societal context is given, it's very interesting. By the way, our art is changing very rapidly, and of course we have, at this moment, to give context, for instance, about politics. Very much art at this moment is very politically loaded. So we have to talk about politics in that contextual sense. Okay?
Thank you, Peter. There's another question. I'm in the corner here, in the back.
Yeah, hi, I'm called Sasha Herman. This might sound like a very ignorant question, but and although I fully appreciate the fact that art critics must have and have the ability to sort of like spread art around and to give people an idea of what art is, I just wanted to know why the future of art or the future of good art rests on the critic and isn't more up to like the masses and just general people out there, and why then art criticism must take a stand over art journalism.
Yeah, it's not ignorance. Thank you very much for your beautiful question, actually. Ignorance doesn't exist. But to give an answer on this quite difficult question, I think that art as such is very strong in the hands of good artists. Let's say, for instance, Pollock, who had his debut in the 30s of the 20th century. He was painting in a quite traditional manner. So then he begins to paint rather weird. Those drippings, you know, from 47, 48, he begins to drip the paint on the canvas. So then something is changing. Somebody sees it. Clement Greenberg, for instance, he saw it already 4 years or 5 years earlier. He writes about it. He says, well, something strange is happening. I don't understand it, but I'm sure it's very important what is happening in that work of Pollock. And it developed in the most masterful paintings the 20th century has produced. But without Greenberg, even Pollock would hang in the museum. So without Greenberg, there also would be a Jackson Pollock we know right now. But the critic or the journalist is important as a word-given man or woman to give the public information. He is very well informed about the background of the artist, about the possibilities of painting, etc. He's all the time working on it, 60 hours a week. And he informs the public as good as he can. So that's his position. But without Greenberg, Pollock would even be as great as he is now, I'm sure. Still, Greenberg had a very, very important function during those 30 years, from 42 till 70. He wrote about Pollock, lesser and lesser, of course, but so it's not, art criticism is not, it's not everything, but it's an important function in our culture, Western and also Eastern culture, although we know nothing about art criticism in China or Turkey or whatever. We don't know about it. But in our Western culture, it's indeed very important, and, well, that's my main topic. It has to come back.
Thank you very much for answering these questions. More questions, I think we should save them for after the panel, then we can also have a broader discussion. Peter, thank you so much again for your talk. An applause, yes, absolutely. Move forward with the panel. So I would like to ask Ali Akay, Birgit Donker, Anthony Downey, and Carol Liu on the stage, and also, of course, my fellow moderator, Amira. So just a few notes on the format. We've asked the speakers to prepare a short statement to sort of begin the panel. The panel will be about I am for an art criticism that is self-reflective. So I'm also looking forward to see what that sentence means if we switch the C and the X, self-reflexive. But we'll get to that later. I think, yeah, we shouldn't sort of hold long anymore, and I think we'll start alphabetically. So, Ali Akay, thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to talk about after your speech, because it is just contrarily that I said yesterday about the birth of critic. You are right. The critic is about judgment, but fortunately, today, critics doesn't exist. The word doesn't exist, and because it's a constant term of the 18th century, this critics, the age of the critic, and it reminds us the tribunal of the judgment. And the critic was the judge of the art, work of art, but in the bad sense. I think the real transformation was in the 70s, yes, you are right, but not really in the 17th, but in the 16th, in the philosophy, with Michel Foucault, when he wrote about the pensée de dehors, the thought of the outside, it was the minorization of the philosophy, something outside of the philosophy, the novelists, the thinkers, the letters, literati persons, was the new philosophers for Michel Foucault. And I think firstly in French world, but also in Turkey in the beginning of the 90s, the writings was changing. It was about the work of art, but in inner quality, substance of the artwork. We left that kind of judgment about the inside quality of the work of art, and as Derrida said in French, il n'y a pas de contexte, mais il y a de hors-texte. There's not only context, but also the outside of the context. This is also in art world. It was the beginning of the porosity of the writings and the porosity of the disciplines, as a history of art, as a philosophy, as a sociology and political science, and then maybe the context and the text becomes more important than this kind of judgment, which is a tribunal of work of art. And it was reflexive in the time of critics in the 18th century. We are talking now about the reflecting. Reflecting is not an inner side of the work of art, but La pensée de dehors of Michel Foucault. It is the outside of the artwork, not only the context, but the agency of the artwork. Agencement, as in the term of Deleuzean term, Gilles Deleuze. The second one, the judgment, we just forget it. Fortunately, the judgment and the critics. And we are talking about understanding the work of art, the language of the artist, and maybe the good writing is not the who want to judge the work of art, but contrary of that, to enter in the language of the artist, to understand what he say, the artist, what she or he say to us, what he explained to us with the artwork. It could be painting, it could be sculpture, it could be photography, it could be everything of material. The material is not important. The idea, the mind is always, from the history of art, this is only the mind which is important. We abandon also the sublime of Kantian term, because sublime for Kant was for the nature, to have a pleasure and pain vis-à-vis of the big mountains like that, because you can't put the contour of this natural object. Now, maybe the sublime, if it exists, just the tableau of Newman, sublime is now. You can just show the line of the sublime, not it is the infinity of the sublime. It is the infinity of the line of Barnett Newman. And also, if we can talk today about sublime, it is not in the work of art, as Harold Zeman said, inside of the work of art, but the disposition of the installation of work of art. It's our context of the work of art, not inner quality of the work of art. And it was representation. The art was representation with the sublime, with the judgment. And now our writing doesn't represent the work of art. Try to open the work of art to the others disciplines. It could be social scene, it could be political scene, it could be art historical scene. But this is only the language which is, I think, interests me. And the contrary of Kant's term, sublime, beauty, etc., was without interest. What we say about work of art of today, it interests me, because the interest is one of the way to have a possibility to enter inside of the work of art of one artist. And maybe my time is finished. I can continue like that, but I stop that.
I think this, could I have the microphone? I think this already gives us a lot to reflect on later. Certainly, indeed, what is being written about the work of art. I guess that's a good question to start with. But we'll continue with Birgit. Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about this interesting subject. I love arts, I love writing, and I love talking, and I can combine all three. So thank you. I followed the questions as they were asked to me, and the first question was, can writing, can art... Is it better like this? Thank you. Can art criticism be self-reflective, was the first question that was posed. I think art criticism needs to be self-reflective, and in fact I think it always will be self-reflective, automatically. Because art criticism for me is about the writer, the critic, and the work of art. And that doesn't mean that the writer has to emphasize this self-reflection, but he shouldn't emphasize his own role, but his role will always be there, because it's about his relationship and his interpretation with this work of art. And the second question was, should criticism be objective, or can it be objective? No. I think objectivity doesn't exist, maybe in general, but especially in writing. It starts with the subject the art critic writes about. If you choose, say, to write about the newest film of Guido van der Werve, you don't write at the same time about another piece of art. A critic always chooses by not writing about a certain piece of art or an exposition. And as it's often said, it's better to have a negative review of a piece of art than not to be reviewed at all. So from the beginning, I think art criticism cannot be objective. Third question was, can art criticism, or should it be a tool of analysis? Yes, absolutely. It should also contain elements of analysis. You can't just say, this is what I see, and ta-da, this is my judgment. Well, you do see this, but that's not good criticism. As Peter de Ruiter just said, art criticism is based on opinions, is opinions based on arguments. So there has to be an analysis, and that's why I think you have to be a specialist as an art critic. You have to see a lot, think about it, and so you can put things in perspective. And now I'm going to disagree with Peter de Ruiter. I think age has nothing to do with this. You can be young and be a very good art critic.
Here, here.
That's what I proved with Karel Botkamp with the decision. He was 22. It's missing a lady from 45 and old and someone just said something. After that, I quit listening.
We can discuss this later.
Then maybe the most important question, what should be the goal and purpose of writing? I think the art critic is part of the public. He is, in general, the first to see a piece of art and to tell about it. So he's very privileged. And the goal of writing should be to select what is worth writing about, to describe, to be enthusiastic, if there's a reason to be, to seduce the public, and also to analyze, to place things in a context. So the thinking about this piece of art, about this artist, and eventually the thinking of contemporary art in general is brought further. So the critic is part of the public, but he's a very privileged viewer because he sees a lot and has a lot of knowledge. And despite this knowledge, and I think that's the most difficult part, he should allow himself to be surprised. So on the one hand, he has to know a lot. on the other hand, approach each work with a completely open mind and not think, seen that, know it, been there. In an article I wrote earlier this year, I made a comparison between an art critic and the mother of Damien Hirst. The mother of Damien Hirst reportedly said, when she knew about him covering a skull with diamonds, "For the love of God, what's he doing now?" And of course, I don't think art critics should have this anxiety all the time. I do think they should ask themselves the question each time, for the love of God, what is this artist doing now? So by being open-minded and analytic at the same time, an art critic contributes to the discourse. And in this way, he can influence the way people think about art. A big responsibility and an interesting job. Thanks.
Thank you. That was really a beautiful statement. I think I really appreciate the fact how you talk about this open-mindedness of the critic and how they actually need to spend time in reflecting and but also putting together the different thoughts into a certain piece. And I wonder as well, maybe this is another question that we can explore further on in the discussion. I mean, is there enough distance for the critic when they write? I'm wondering what is the thin line as well between the reactionary writing, but also the professionalization of writing and having to deal with certain constraints. How can this actually affect a certain quality? Can you achieve a distance when being put within these different constraints of the job? And in that sense, it also, I wanted to link it slightly to the discussion that we were having in relation to Peter de Ruiter's lecture with the difference between journalism and critique. And I just wanted to bring in one factor, and it's the factor of time as well. I think the journal and the magazine or the publication deal with time in a different way, and their let's say, life expectancy is also slightly different. A journal is something that is a daily, a weekly, while the magazine is either the monthly. But I'll leave it on that note, just some more food for thought, and I think we can now move to Anthony Downey and hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Amira, and thank you again for inviting me, and I'd like to thank Daphne and Hendrik for hosting us today. Folks, for those of you who were in Rotterdam yesterday, I spoke very specifically to the problematic of art criticism as it is applied to North Africa and the Middle East, and that's very much an area of concern for me. Today I want to be a little bit more general, but I want you to bear in mind that my critique, as I offer it here today, of the discourse of human rights and the discourse of ethics as it is used in contemporary art criticism is applicable to North Africa and the Middle East. That's very much my focus. So, briefly, I'm for an art criticism that is self-reflective. Yes, I mean, everyone's for an art criticism that's self-reflective. To say I'm for an art criticism that is self-reflective, I think is the equivalent of saying, you know, in order to live, I am for breathing through my nose and out my mouth. Let's just take it as a given that art criticism should be self-reflective. However, it's surprising, increasingly surprising to me, how little art criticism is self-reflective. So today I want to suggest that art criticism should not only be just self-reflective, it should also be productive rather than reproductive. And I want to just demonstrate what I mean by reproductive. I have noted recently a preponderance of certain words that are used in art criticism. And I'll just give you an example of these. Discursive, ethics, globality, experienceability, transversal, biopolitical, negation, dialectics, and precarity. These are the buzzwords currently being used in what I would consider to be reproductive forms of art criticism. And I know these are the buzzwords that I use because, hands up, I've used all of these words myself. In fact, I'm sure I've managed to get them at one time or another into one sentence. However, I hope I've done that in a reflective way, a self-reflective way. Of course, I might be just deluded, but I hope I've done it in a self-reflective way. But there is a serious point. Language produces discourse. Language produces systems of thought. And what I would like to suggest here today is this language here, the language that I've just reiterated, produces a system of thought that is invested in a linguistic economy of neoliberal thought. And I'll just give you further examples of what these words give rise to. And they give rise to these ill-defined terms such as democracy, freedom, liberty, equality, human rights, ethics, humanism, and secularism. And I would argue that there is very, very little self-reflexivity about these terms. And I think these terms are tremendously problematic. I note that a lot of art criticism that is used in relation to North Africa and the Middle East has a barely concealed contempt for those who do not subscribe to liberal secularism. And I think this is truly problematic. So what is this liberal secularism? Liberal secularism is arguably supported by the ideal of human rights and ethics. And I want to argue that these are part of the problem. Human rights, as a discourse as we use it presently, is nothing more than a sticking plaster used by neoliberalism to paper over the cracks left behind by globalization and the capitalist ethos of accumulation by dispossession. Human rights are the rights of the rightless. They are worth nothing. The rights that we today espouse are worth nothing to the very people who need them. However, this discourse of human rights keeps emerging in contemporary art criticism, specifically contemporary art criticism that deals with North Africa and the Middle East. Ethics, as a discourse used today, is merely a form of moral piety that supports precisely this application of human rights. So I want to argue that these two issues, human rights, ethics, as they are used in contemporary art criticism, are part of the problem, not the solution. And I'm amazed how little self-reflexivity there is about these terms. I'm genuinely surprised that very few writers that I know of, and this is a subject that interests me, have bothered to engage with these issues. It is arguable that the discourse of human rights and ethics have merely replaced the old imperial ideals of otherness and difference. And I think what you have is effectively a reinscription of that neo-imperial ideal of the other through discourses of ethics and human rights. I want to put my cards on the table. These ideas are not mine per se, and the person that I found most useful in developing and articulating these ideas is the French philosopher Alain Badiou. And I'm sure a lot of the audience here today are familiar with Alain Badiou, but I just want to quote very briefly from a mercifully short book by Alain Badiou, and that book is called Ethics, and the subtitle of that book is called Towards an Understanding of Evil. We must reject, Badiou writes, the ideological framework of ethics and concede nothing to the negative and victimary definition of man. There is no ethics in general, there are only, eventually, ethics of processes by which we treat the possibilities of a situation. What Badiou is arguing for simply is a situated ethics, an ethics of context. What is lacking, I find, in a lot of art criticism about North Africa and the Middle East is precisely that situatedness, precisely this sense of context. This problem becomes compounded as well because these systems of thought, these languages that are used, this economy of neoliberal ethos, merely compounds the problem, and it keeps snowballing further and further into what I think a kind of clash of civilizations rhetoric, and that's something we spoke about yesterday. And I want to speak very briefly to Samuel Weber's essay in the 1980s, where he says the following: a critique which does not consider the conflictual structure of its own discursive operations will only reproduce the constraints it is seeking to displace. And I would argue that a lot of art criticism today, art criticism that is not self-reflective, art criticism that is not productive, art criticism that is merely reproductive, reproduces precisely the problems that it is trying to address. So where does that leave us? I'm arguing for a form of productive criticism that is indeed self-reflective, not reproductive criticism that merely mimics the latest trend of social theory or indeed philosophy. And again, I think I need to be as clear as possible about that. And just to finish, I want to give you two examples of critics, two examples of definitions of critics at least. Both of them come from literary sources. The first is from Samuel Beckett, and it's from his play Waiting for Godot. I'm sure you're all familiar with Waiting for Godot, but I think it was best summed up by the Irish critic Vivian Mercier, who wrote in 1956 that Waiting for Godot is a play in which nothing happens twice. And I think this, again, is almost like a definition of contemporary criticism sometimes, nothing happening twice, or indeed nothing happening 12 times a year, depending on your publishing schedule. But briefly, this is Estragon and Vladimir standing in a field. And I'm sure you guys know what happens. They're basically trying to amuse themselves. They decide in order to amuse themselves, they're going to abuse one another. They're going to abuse one another with language. Vladimir to Estragon. Moron, Estragon. Vermin, Vladimir. Abortion, Estragon. Morpion, Vladimir. Sewer rat, Estragon. Curate, Vladimir. Cretin, Estragon. With finality, critic. Vladimir is deflated by this. The worst form of abuse that can be actually leveled towards him is critic. And for those of you wondering what a morpion is a form of pubic lice. So effectively, Estragon believes that Vladimir, or the critic, is lower than pubic lice. And I think what Beckett's getting at there through these actors is the notion of the critic as parasite, the notion of the critic as a mere reproducer as opposed to producer. And I think, again, what he encapsulates there is something quite profound in terms of what it is to be a critic and what it could be to be a critic. And I'll just point out that Samuel Beckett's most extended engagement with criticism was not with literary criticism. It was actually with a Dutch painter called Bram van Velde, whom I'm sure is familiar to a lot of the audience here today. And you can still buy those essays. There are 3 of them in total, and there's a number of conversations that he carried out in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The second definition of critic I take from another Irish writer, and that's Oscar Wilde. It's from an essay, and funnily enough, Amira and I were discussing this. The essay is called The Critic as Artist. And I think that just about sums it up. What Wilde is suggesting in The Critic as Artist is that the critic has to be on a par with the artist. He, she has to be as productive and as creative as the artist. And interestingly, Amira said that she considered the title of Oscar Wilde's essay as a potential title for this conference. I didn't know that at the time. But the essay was written in 1891, and I happen to have a first edition of it here, as one does. And I just want to read very briefly. You got 2 guys sitting in a room. It's very Victorian. You've got Ernest and Gilbert, and they're smoking cigarettes and being very louche. And it's a difficult essay to read. It's about 200 pages long, super boring in parts, but there are nuggets of absolute genius. And I just want to read very briefly from this, because I think this is Wilde getting to the ideal of the critic as productive as opposed to reproductive. Hours ago, Ernest, you asked me the use of criticism. You might as well just have asked me the use of thought. It is criticism that creates the intellectual atmosphere of the age. It is criticism that makes the mind a fine instrument. It is criticism that, by concentration, makes culture possible. And I think that's a truly profound thing to say, because it reverses the polarities of thought that we have about criticism. This is criticism at the forefront of an intellectual atmosphere. This is criticism producing culture. This is self-reflexive criticism as a form of production as opposed to mere reproduction. So, in conclusion, it is indeed criticism that makes culture possible, but only a critical form that questions its own legitimacy, and, to quote Samuel Weber, a criticism that acknowledges the conflictual structure of its own discursive operations. And I can even boil that down further. If you're going to write art criticism, be honest about your motivations for doing so. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for this bold and elaborate statement, which indeed deserves applause. Also, look forward to maybe linking it to the first 2 presentations of Birgit and Ali saying, you said, what do we say about the work of art now? Well, I think that links wonderfully with your talk as well, like saying what kind of discourse are we producing, again, with this art criticism that should talk about the work of art as its central point. And of course, Birgit, you asked what kind of analytical tools are we using to this, which also links. So enough to link, enough to connect. We won't do it just yet, because Carol Lou, I look forward to your statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My thoughts and reflections that I'm gonna try and share this afternoon was very much prompted by a lot of the discussion yesterday. So to begin with, I would say I'm for an art criticism that reflects on itself. I want to start by being self-reflexive about the discussion of the last day. I was missing a bit some self-reflection on the practice of art criticism itself? Are we critical of the practice of art criticism itself as a form of intellectual practice, a form of creative practice? I want to take this opportunity to not just reflect on the external politics, structures for and conditions of art criticism, but to draw attention to the contemplation of the form, the practice, the medium of expression itself. There are issues we think about when we talk about artworks, when we look at exhibitions. There are things we refer to and talk about when we consider the making of a work or the making of an exhibition. If we are to take our critical writing as a creative form of practice, as an artistic practice, what are the questions we should ask when we consider the writing of a piece of art criticism? What are the considerations we should take into account when we read a piece of art criticism? Is there criticism of art criticism itself? Are there attempts and experiments made by art critics and writers to expand our understanding and definition of the medium as in art practice and curatorial practice? Have we given enough attention and thoughts to the means and instruments in art criticism? If we are taking art criticism seriously as a practice, shouldn't we really look at it closely, critically, examine it constantly, think about it with the same degree of anxiety, agony, and persistence like how an artist approaches his or her practice? Have attempts been made to look at the historical development of art criticism and to discuss it as such so that we don't have this sense that art criticism itself is entirely subject to forces such as the market or the art system? What are the models for art criticism? And are new models emerging also? What are the different styles of art critical writing, how they have come about? Are we developing an awareness of art criticism with the same degree of attention, descriptive and analytical precision, or discursive innovation as we have created for exhibitions making, for instance? Are we pushing for and initiating conditions for discourses and reinventions of art criticism itself? I recently read a short essay by Christian Rettermeier in The Exhibitionist. In this essay, he argued about the necessity of writing a history of exhibitions, and more importantly, he made a distinction between exhibitions and curatorial practice, and wrote that exhibitions are for curatorial practice just as how artworks are in relation to artistic practice. The result itself needs to be analyzed and studied with serious scholarship. Now, can we apply a similar way of thinking towards art criticism? Do we ask enough what art criticism is and what else can it be? In the spring of 1965, dozens of New York artists met for a two-part invitation-only walled-off panels on sculpture. In the beginning of the panel, one of the panelists explained that the reason it was just for a pure gathering of sculptors and artists rather than one with art critics was that they wanted to just talk about things that face as artists when they open the doors of their studio every day. Their anxiety as creators and the pressure they experience from the liveliness of the experimental spirit in other practices emerging around this time in America and in Europe, a kind of pressure from inside of practice. What kind of internal, peer-to-peer pressure and expectations we are facing when we open our notebook to write? With this short statement, I would like to call our attention to art criticism, a form of practice and a form of expression that we do passionately with or without support, just like artists make their works, an unconditional commitment, an everyday practice, and a serious and imaginative endeavor, an artistic form that requires constant critical examination and self-reflection. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Maybe just immediately sort of diving in, and I think we should sort of give you some questions to think about, but a very short question to begin with. Like, how would you answer the question, what is the object of art criticism, which also leads up to your question, really? Because you talk about sort of the exhibition, of course, being the object of exhibition history. The artwork is obviously the object of art history. And how can we get to, also to link to our opening talk of today, get to an object of art criticism, maybe?
Maybe this is an attempt to answer your question. I would say the object of art criticism is primarily an attempt to understand and to get insight of the practice of an artist.
I mean, I think it's also interesting to point out in relation to the different panels that also happened yesterday, this idea of production and how criticism is a process of production. It starts with the text, but then it also continues and engages, I think, with further, with more context and goes beyond, basically. And I would like to link that to also what you were saying yesterday, during the panel, I am for an art criticism that is universal, when you talked about writing as a creative process. And today you are bringing this idea also back again in the sense of critics are similar to the artist. And then we hear this text by Oscar Wilde where the critic as artist. And I think it's really parallels that we're getting to in general. But I mean, having said that, I also feel that maybe we can also question this idea of being the subject of critique, but also having to be self-reflective. I don't know.
Ali, would you like to respond to
Maybe
this?
I can say that one of the most interesting writing that I never read in the art scene was writing by Bill Viola for Terry Kunzel. Two artists understanding each other, and they are friends also, they know their works, and at that time there's a kind of adequation with the writing vis-a-vis of the work of art, I think. And for that reason, maybe the best writers are maybe the artists, yes, I agree.
Birgit, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah. I think that art criticism has different layers. That first it's what do you see, what do you experience? And you asked me earlier, that doesn't imply a distance. No, not at all. But at the same time, you can also have this distance and analyze and say, what does this work say about the work of this artist? And what does it say about contemporary art? I think in a good critic, you have all these layers, and it shouldn't be distant at all. I'm not sure if artists make good critics. They can be, but not in general.
If you want, this kind of, you are talking about objectivity and subjectivity. If we are not subject, we are some kind of porous individual. And as I said yesterday, we are superjet, not the subject. We can't judge from ourselves some object of work of art, but we can just use the language of work of art coming to us, using these components of the work of art without to be subject, without to be individual, because all the language that we spend when we speak doesn't belong to us. We learn all. We are not subject.
And Ali, how in that process can we become self-aware of self-critical, to maybe come back to a theme?
Self-critical, I don't know, what is it?
It's a good question to you.
Yes, I think we can just say maybe what we are going to spend from the words and from sentence with our enunciation. This is this kind of agency of our function. Is a function of the writer. We reflect that's just a mirror, what we saw in context of the work of art, and the outside of the work of art, and the inside of the work of art. There are also porosity between the work of art and the outside and context and our context. And I think we can just analyze all of these components if we can say we can write something. And the best writers are artists, I think, because they know, and they knew more than us, this kind of agencement of the agency of the components of work of art and the outside of the work of art. And maybe as a philosopher, as a critic, as a sociologist, as a historian of art, we are outside of the context and the our text. And we can't understand if we judge the work of art, but we can just enter inside of the language of the work of art. This is my position.
I mean, that's an interesting point, and just to follow up on that, and also to link it a little bit to this idea of creating new models that you were mentioning, Carol, I'd like to mention actually the conversations that Hendrik and I have been having concerning this panel, and it's about the institutional position in it all. So when you say that we are outside the context, when we're talking about criticism, and we are actually staging these events in institutions, this is happening today at the Stedelijk, yesterday it was at the Witte de Wit, we are here actually talking about writing, we are talking about criticism, and I am wondering if institutions are also developing new platforms for creating discourse, something that new approaches for that. And Hendrik and I remember also yesterday, we both agreed that, for instance, public programming that emphasizes this idea of discourse in institutions is crucial and it's important. And that's I mean, the Stedelijk has a very active public program, and Witte de Wit has dedicated a big part of its exhibition space to a setting that hosts public events. And yeah.
So, Anthony, would you care to?
Was I nodding in agreement?
You were nodding very loudly. So.
Well, actually, yes. You know what? If I hear the phrase "crisis in art criticism" one more time, I'm going to have an aneurysm. I'm sure Denis Diderot, when he sat down and started to formulate what was the originary discourse of art criticism, had a crisis. It's ongoing. What I find is that this is a total misnomer. It actually displaces where we should be looking. There is no crisis in art criticism. In fact, art criticism, I feel, has never been in a better place to self-reflect upon its means of producing discourse. The amount of people that I meet on a regular basis producing art criticism is extraordinary. The amount of honest, critical people out there who are doing this, who are motivated to do it, I think is extraordinary. There is no crisis in art criticism. The only crisis in art criticism is this dialogue about crisis in art criticism. And I think, it would be interesting to sort of progress that perhaps and look at, who art critics actually are. And I did a mental check in my head on the way to here, Amsterdam, today. And I thought of 10 art critics that I know, and every single one of them, old, young, male, female, are either failed artists or indeed failed fiction writers. And I was amazed by that. Every single one of them, myself included. I wanted to be an artist until I realized it was super hard work. And it's a very lonely pursuit, and you don't get much for it, and in fact, it's really hit and miss. And I thought to myself, okay, I will explore my creativity in a different way by writing about the creative practice in hopefully a creative way. So again, we talk about who make the best art critics. I think failed artists make really good art critics, actually. And if my friends are anything to go by, that seems to be the first step to being an art critic, being a failed artist or a failed fiction writer. So the institutional discourse around art criticism today, I think, has never been stronger. It's never been more proactive. It's never been more interrogative. And yet we keep coming up against this other argument whereby somehow the market, the logic of the market, has usurped art criticism or usurped critical thinking. The logic of the art market has not usurped art criticism. It has not usurped critical discourse. To argue that is simply misguided, because I have news for everyone here. We are the market. We produce the market. We invest in the market. We are the consumers of the market. The market imbricates every single thing we do. We support the market. So again, I feel we have to move away from that, and we have to focus on what is positive. I am an idealist at heart. I genuinely believe in the power of words, the power of language, the power of systems of thought to change things. And I genuinely believe that art criticism in institutional contexts as it is presently in education programs, as Amira suggests, is producing discourses that are producing better artists.
And that is self-critical, actually. The institution as well is questioning and staging these.
And also this so-called crisis in art criticism, I mean, it seems to be more often than not about the form rather than what is actually being said. So that may also sort of add to your point that, you know, what are we exactly talking about when we talk about this crisis in it, and should we not focus more on the content rather than sort of the form in which it appears? Birgit, do you maybe want to add to that? I mean, you've written for so many various platforms in that, and do you think that sort of the debate in the Netherlands in particular has the critical means to look at itself, at art criticism, I mean?
Well, if I may first say something about the discussion about what art criticism should be about and who should write critics, I think there's a difference. As I said before, I think an art critic is part of the public, so a failed artist can be a very good art critic, but it's not necessary. Then about the self-criticism, yeah, I think maybe, as you said, we talk too much about it, you can talk yourself into a crisis. And what's often meant is that there's less space for art criticism in the newspapers. All articles get shorter, and the critics also. And if you write a good analysis, you need words, you need space. But the good thing is there is the internet with space available as much as you would like, and images, moving images. And I think there is a great future for.
But of course, the internet does not have an economy to support writers.
Yeah, well, that's very at the moment it doesn't, but that's what we should look for. I mean, if you have real good content, and if you can really join up, and I think then you could have something that can be supported on the internet. Yeah, and it's also because we started on the internet by saying it has to be free, so we started off in the wrong direction. So now we have to say why it should be worth something and use it.
Could I just add to that very briefly? I recall, and I am old enough to remember when the internet first started, everybody said this is the end of the book, the end of civilization, we're all going to die in a field. In fact, quite the opposite happened. The internet reinvigorated the book, access to books. I buy more books now than I ever did in my entire life through the internet. I have access to more books than I ever had in any time in my life through the internet. I get access to more writers through the internet. And I think what the internet has done, and I'm thinking of, you know, what Brian's done in New York with Anton, with eFlux, what Gerard's done with his website, Hypoallergenic, is basically reinvigorated what art criticism can be. Art criticism hasn't went away. It's been rejuvenated by the internet. The internet has recreated what it can be. Yes, there's a lot of nonsense on the internet. Yes, there's a lot of misguided people, you know, sort of doing blogs and so forth. But you know what? I'd rather they were doing that than something else. I still think this adds to the debate. I don't think we need to hierarchize that, and I think we need to look at how the internet has reinvigorated access to art itself and art critical discourse.
In relation to that, I would certainly like to point to this evening as well, when the Young Art Critics Prize, for the first time there is a section for internet criticism, which I think is very admirable, and I'm looking forward to that as well. But that's shameless PR. Let's get back to discussion. Of course, I mean, you are sitting there watching us, but of course, at any time, if you want to interrupt or add to this discussion, or if you have a question or comment, please just raise your finger and I'll make sure that someone sort of gets to you very soon. Looking around, no questions yet? Well, good.
I had a question in regards to Anthony's point about human rights and a lot of these terms that he called neoliberal, what did you say? Colonialism or akin to
The
colonialism?
ethos of neoliberal secularism.
Okay.
They're sticking plasters to make us feel better.
Now, is there a way of talking about those topics without falling into that trap?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, there are some great people doing it already. I would advise anyone that wants to read a thoroughly sort of critical take on what the discourse of human rights and the discourse of ethics are doing to present thought about issues such as globalization. I would direct Lampadieu in the first instance. Jacques Rancière has written for over 25 years on this subject. A dear friend of mine in New York, Simon Critchley, the philosopher, has written in intimate detail about the problematic of ethics. I think, again, Hendrik, just to come back to that, I am not saying that ethics as a discourse is redundant. I am saying that the discourse of ethics that we employ presently is redundant, and we need to reconsider what precisely we are doing with that discourse, because I think it's now part of the problem as opposed to a solution.
Are there any other questions at this point? Sorry, Amira.
Well, I rather have a remark, because I hear a lot of talk about blogs, and it's almost being suggested as if the whole internet is swarming with people writing about art on the internet. Well, I can tell you not so. I actually know 2 people who blog about contemporary music in the Netherlands, and one of them happens to be me. Well, on the whole, there's second news for you. Blogging is basically dead. There are websites which are built on a blog format, but the thing of someone starting a blog on his own to ventilate his opinion is basically something that belonged to the previous decade. People now communicate on Facebook. And yes, sometimes they post blurbs on Facebook, but as we are all in a cultural family, there is quite a lot of peer-to-peer communication on Facebook, which is not art criticism in that sense, but which is rather qualitatively high between, well, maybe not in the official art scene, but in the new music scene, it is. There is really good, substantial discussion on Facebook. It's possible. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I mean, I think perhaps we could also consider that focusing on just these ideas of the blogs on the internet may be too specific with all the different actually things that the internet offers and how criticism can be formulated outside of just the blog on the internet. I think we could make a very long list of that. But
Can I add one thing to that? My dream is that we would have a digital magazine on the internet, joining all the forces we have now in the Netherlands in magazines on arts. I think that could be...
There are some applications.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that.
Maybe the big difference between the old generation of critics and the new generation of Facebook writers is the old generation was writing for the pleasure to judge. But nowadays, the young generation of Facebook, they're writing for all of life. This is the full-time writers. All the time they write something in Twitter and Facebook. For the old generation of article in newspaper or review, they wrote something, but because they like it for some moment. And for the Facebook writers, they are all the time they wrote and wrote, etc.
Well, I also think we shouldn't confuse this idea of circulation of information on the internet with the idea of actually writing a text or formulating a critique. And we shouldn't underestimate the reader either and their ability to make the difference. It's a little bit with, you know, we write a lot of text, let's say, in an institution, then should you dumb it down, should you not? Should you underestimate your reader, should you not? It also has to do with that, I think. Hendrik, would you like to add something to this?
Oh yeah, I mean, it marks also the point that Jörg Heiser made yesterday, of course, that sort of a stream of information such as disseminated by WikiLeaks, etc., is certainly not the same as a journalism that sort of uses that information to make a story or to tell a certain history. And I guess, I mean, the same could be said for an online criticism as it is now. Speaking indeed, I don't know about the contemporary music scene. I mean, obviously talking about visual arts here, and sort of the things I get from that kind of criticism, it's indeed more like a data stream online than an actual combined package of critique. But I mean, of course, I mean, one could try to strive for a digital magazine, but yeah, there needs to be an infrastructure for it as well, of course. Maybe Birgit, you can tell something more about that. No, I didn't mean it like that, but more like, how do you envision it?
Well, I think it's what compares most to the Harry Potter newspaper, the Daily Prophet. I don't know if you know it.
Never read it.
That changes regularly, and it has films moving, and it also is interactive, and I think, and what we as a Mondrian Fund, we can't support art magazines anymore next year, but we can support innovative ways of art publishing. So this is something, especially if different magazines work together, that we could support initiatives in this way. And I think this might be an interesting way. And as you pointed out, of course, it's the million-dollar question is how to earn money with it, of course. But I think we should try. And yeah.
Carol, I mean, you indeed spoke a lot about creative writing and sort of the artistic act in writing. Do you see that also happening on internet platforms?
I see that happening on many platforms. There were, if I go back to the specific context in China, and I think this kind of attempts have always been there. It's not just now with the availability of the internet. In the 80s in China, for instance, there was no magazines, publications for independent writers of poetry, writers of fiction, to get published and to be read. So they got together and initiate a publication that comes out once a year. And in this publication, half of the publication were their own writings, their fiction, their poetry. And the latter half of the publication was entirely about critical writing about their own writing. So the writers wrote about, there was not much of a literature critique around, but the writers write about their peers' writings. So I think the critical discourse has always existed as a necessity. If there are no art critics or there are no platforms, artists, practitioners initiate it. So I don't think these external conditions matter as much. It's more the desire to write and to express that matter and energize the practice itself.
Indeed. Amira, do you want to add, or can we take some questions from the floor? We should keep a bit of a track of time as we have a big evening ahead of us. I think, in this panel we've meandered through a lot of issues that sort of slightly touch or really touch on the notion of self-criticality within art criticism, which of course is quite a difficult issue to grasp in the end. But I do think one of the main questions, indeed, I mean, sort of came at the beginning as well. Like, what do we say about the work of art in the end, and sort of from what position we speak and on what, basically, and that sort of also links to in what kind of medium we speak about it, whether that be internet and some kind of other form of criticism. That's sort of one of the final thoughts I have on it, and which I would like to continue, but Amira, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I'll just say a few words to wrap up the symposium. I mean, it's been really great a couple of days, and I think I'm not gonna add more questions. I think we are all filled with questions, and so much has been said in the past, and yesterday and today. But what I would just like to take the opportunity and do is actually thank every single participant, every single speaker, every single audience member who has bared with us through this symposium. I mean, as you can imagine, it's pretty nerve-wracking actually organizing a symposium, just because it's all so dependent on what everyone has to say, and you have to trust them. And I can only say that it's been a successful because everyone that has participated and shared their thoughts with us was just allowed it to be a great success. So thank you all, and thank you, Hendrik, for everything, and the whole team at the Stedelijk, and Daphne.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Amira, for taking the train from the first day we actually conceived it and organizing everything. You've been amazing. I also want to announce we're actually in the formation of a digital platform, and we're thinking, and thanks to you, the participants, we've been also thinking what is needed as well. So it is something that our team, Adam Kleinman and Amira, we're all working on it, and we want to see what is possible apart from some of the existing platforms out there. And also want to say that the symposium, we made it possible with the funding we have for our exhibition. So we actually gave up one exhibition to be able to be more dedicated to this type of discursivity, and we didn't get funding actually for this symposium. Just to put it out there to the record in a very eloquent way. Thank you.
Well done, Amira. Well done. Thanks. Just to have your attention for a few more minutes. Of course, also thanking the speakers and the audience and everyone who was involved on behalf of the Stedelijk. But our day is certainly not over yet. We have a big evening ahead of us, and it's going to be a very exciting evening, as we will have a look to a very substantial example of the future of art criticism in the Netherlands, namely 3 fabulous young art writers who will be awarded the prize in different categories, namely the essay, the review, and internet criticism. The ceremony starts at 7:30. It will also include discussions and some brief statements, which will be slightly more focused on the Dutch art context, but very interesting to watch. Unfortunately for English speakers, I welcome you to the exhibitions, but the event this evening will be in Dutch, but I hope you can stick around in any rate. And so be back here in the auditorium at 7:30, and I hope to see you then. Thank you very much.